Welcome everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. First of the month, first in our series of the August webinar series for critical path training. I'm glad everyone decided to spend a little time with us today. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a second. Just let me ask you, Karen, are you able to see my slides and hear my voice okay?
Yes, everything looks good.
Okay, well great. Let's go ahead and get started. So what we want to look at today is basically just kind of getting more into query design. And we're going to start by looking at Power BI Desktop. We're also going to take a look at Dataflows and see how they factor in. So note that all the slides that I'm going to show today, as well as the sample code, some of the data and Power BI sample projects, are included inside of this directory. So if you go to github.com, critical path training /intro to M, here is, for instance, the advanced query design PDF. If I go ahead and click on that, note that it just basically shows me the PDF of the slides that I'm going to be using today. So that's available to you, as is the sample data and some of the Power BI desktop projects that we're going to be showing here. Okay, so what we're going to look at is I'm going to start just by talking about the query design experience in Power BI Desktop, the one that we've had for several years. And we'll start with a couple neat techniques, but then we'll talk about applied steps and we'll talk about the M code behind it. And we'll start talking about how to write more advanced queries, by not being afraid of the M programming language. Okay, by the time we get to the end, we're going to show some advanced techniques with function queries and using query parameters as well. Okay, now Power BI Desktop, has performed the ETL tooling for us. And ETL meaning we need to extract data. Once we extract it from its data source, transform it, whether it's cleaning, whether it's reshaping, and then I need to load it in so I can use it for the basis of a report or a dashboard. Now, with Power BI Desktop, we have this notion of query steps. And the idea is that as you're starting to build your query steps, you're starting to basically put the logic together. Now, behind the query steps, every time you add a step, there's going to be a line of code written in this language called M, also known as the Power Query Formula language. And some people like to use the WYSIWYG environment and never look at the M code. Other people like to look at the M code just to see what it's doing. And some more adventurous types are willing to actually, jump into the places in Power BI Desktop where you can actually modify the M code directly. Of course, you have to know what you're doing because you can break things, in such a way that you might not be able to recover from it, if you're very, very new to working with M. Now, there's a step formula bar. So one of the things that we're able to do, is take a look at the M code as we're writing it. Also, I can see the steps over there on the right. Now, let's go ahead and create a project. Now, inside of this demo, what I want to do is I kind of want to take a look at some sample data that I have to kind of show these first two techniques. So the first thing that we want to do is we have this underlying data for our employees, and every employee gets an ID, but then every employee has a column, which is the manager, but it doesn't tell you the manager's name, it tells you the manager's ID. So let's go ahead and kind of use a neat trick. So what we're going to do is we're going to load in Power BI Desktop. And now if I say, let's go ahead and get data, and I'm just going to get it from this sample data source inside here. And so what I want to show in this first technique is that you can merge two tables together to combine the columns. You can also perform a self-join. So in our case right here, what I want to do is I want to take that employees table. And let's go ahead and click on Edit. So now we're inside of the query editor. Now note that I can kind of see M code that's already been written up here. If I go to the View menu, I can basically toggle something which is known as the formula bar on or off, and I can basically see the M code here. Okay, also note that if I click on the Advanced Editor, I can see the M code behind. This is an editable view if I want to get in there. And once again, there are many extreme opinions. One is I don't like M code. I don't ever want to see it. let's go ahead and hide the formula bar and just use the WYSIWYG tool. The other extreme is people who just, want to go to the advanced editor and write code here. And I think most people, find that they use the WYSIWYG environment as much as possible and then modify the M code in times when you have to achieve a certain effect. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to just use the tool, and I'm going to go back to the Home tab, and I have Merge Queries, and we're going to say I want to merge two queries together. But what we're going to end up doing is we're going to merge the table with itself. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of pull the manager information. So I'm going to click Manager up top. I'm going to click ID down below. And the idea is I want to bring the manager information right to the right of the employee information inside there. Okay, let's go ahead and choose OK. And so now what we've done is we've basically gotten something where I can now expand. And what do I want to see here? I want to see the first name, last name. Notice that they kind of came up with an arbitrary column name of change typed here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait until after they've been created. And now I'm simply going to take column 1 and column 2, and I'm going to right click and I'm going to say merge these two together. And it's the first name and last name of the manager. So let's go ahead and add a space between them. And then what is this new column name going to be? It is going to be the manager column. Okay, and now that we've done that, we can do the same thing over here. Let's go ahead and merge these two columns together. And let's put a space between them. That is the name of the employee inside there. And so now that we've done that, we might find that I can take manager, and let's go ahead and take the manager and the ID column. Maybe for our final list, we don't want to see those. We'll go ahead and remove them. We'll go ahead and give this the name of manager. And now as we return the query, we've basically gotten what we want, a list of the employee and the manager right next to it. Okay, and once again, I could have written this M code by hand, but certainly it's a lot easier to kind of use the tool set and don't dip in and write M code just for the sake of writing M code. Write it when it's necessary, and to perform something like this, it was not necessary. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go and we're going to look at a kind of a second scenario here. So we've just looked at the self-join. And now what we want to do is look at a scenario where I've got this data. So I have this one customer, and they want to look at different projects that they're working on and see some type of visualization of what projects have expanded across what states. Now, the problem with what's on the left is that I can't map a column that has FL and TX and GA. So we need to perform some type of a transform so that I basically get, one project state per row. And in general, what we want to do is we want to take this column value that has delimited column values and expand that, into one row per value. Now, excuse me, let's go back here, and we're going to say recent data sources. Let's go back to where we just were, because this sample data is also inside of this little sample worksheet. Okay, so now what we have is we're going to have a projects table, and we'll call this projects state table, or projects in state. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by going to the state column, and we're going to split this into multiple columns. So I'm going to say split column, and by delimiter. What's the delimiter? And it correctly chose column because it was able to look at the data. Note that here I have one that has up to 5. So if you need to deal with going out 10 columns, you can basically change this. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and expand out, and now I have these 5 different columns, and it could have been 10 columns, it could have been 15 columns. Now we're going to go back to project and select it. And now here's a really neat trick. We're going to basically come down and we're going to say unpivot other columns. And so the effect that has is every different value now goes into its own row. And inside that row, they have the column name. And that column name is just not interesting to us. So we're going to go ahead and delete the column that has the column name. Let's go ahead and remove that. We'll go ahead and we'll take value. We'll change it to the name of state. And now that we've done that, let's go ahead and do a close and apply. And so now that we've done a close and apply, here's the effect that we want. Let's go ahead and we'll create first of all, a slicer. And our slicer, we're going to be able to pick a particular project inside of our slicer, project A, B, or C. Great. Now let's go ahead and second, we'll create a filled map, which will have the project and the state. And so now what we're going to be able to do, is basically look at project A and project B and project C. And, the only way we're going to be able to get this mapping information, the way that we wanted to do that, was once again to perform this transform when we're taking delimited column values and expanding it to, to one row per value. Okay. Now, let's go just a little bit further here. So, as you start working with queries in Power BI Desktop and we start getting a little bit more advanced, we come into circumstances, where we have to start writing some M code. So let's look at a scenario. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say I want to get data, and I want to get a specific place. Now, if I go to recent sources, let me see if I still have this in here. Yes, I have a database, cpt.database.windows.net, wingtip sales DB. So I want to connect to this, and here is our customers table. So let's go ahead and put that into the editor right here. And what do I want to do? So I'm going to stay in import mode, where I have the most flexibility, with the with Power Query. And so if I now start by looking at the columns that I want. Okay, so let's say we want customer ID, first name, last name. We don't want any of the personal information or location other than city, state, zip code. Let's say I take the gender. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two different fields, which are first purchase date and last purchase date. Now, one of the reasons I'm going to do this, and for this demo, I'm going to get rid of the other things that we don't want in here. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to kind of start seeing for our customers, and maybe I'll take first name and last name, and we'll quickly merge these columns together. We'll put a space in between them. That is going to be the name of our customer. What we'd like to do is we'd like to figure out which customers are repeat customers versus one-time customers. So we have a first purchase date and a last purchase date. One other thing I like to do is, unless I know I need to care about the granularity within a day, I'm going to take date time columns and basically convert them just to pure date. Now, what we have is we have a scenario where each time someone makes a purchase, we're going to update last purchase date. We also record the first purchase date. So the logic we're going to use is if first purchase date and last purchase date are not equal, the customer has bought at least twice from us, therefore it's a repeat customer. If it's the same, well, you're not a repeat customer. Now, if I go to add column, there is a custom column choice. So let's choose custom column. And so what is this going to be? This is going to be the customer type. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically look at the first purchase date and compare it to the last purchase date. So now when I work with M, there is a if, and when I have my if, there is a then, and there is a else. Okay, let's see if I can get this correct. If, then, and else. Okay, there's some new IntelliSense here that's giving me a hard time, but what we need to do now is have some type of an if statement. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if the first purchase date And notice that I can just go ahead and insert that. I'll type in the equal sign. And now last purchase date, if those two things are the same, we have a one-time customer. If not, we have a repeat customer inside there. Okay, and now that we've got that inside there, what is this error that I've got? Okay, and you can see that case matters inside here. Okay, but now let's go ahead and choose OK. And what you can see is that, I've written the logic so that when these two things are equal, we mark someone as a repeat customer. Now, what I want to do is let's go to View. Let's look at the advanced editor, and what did we really get when I did that inside there? They were to add a column, and you can kind of see that, you have that logic that I wrote, that gets written inside. Now, let's say that, once I've taken this logic, and I basically got this M code inside here that does a specific thing. Okay, now let's go ahead and talk about data flows. Now, Microsoft had Power BI Desktop, many years back, and as it came out, it had Power Query, and behind Power Query is this engine, which is known as the mashup engine, which basically takes your M code and runs the logic inside there. Now, some of the issues that we have with Power BI Desktop is that if me and 3 other fellows go ahead and build Power BI Desktop projects on the exact same database, we basically keep taxing that database. Every time we refresh any of the data sets, we have to go back and keep pulling data back. So one nice thing about data flows is that you can build a data flow and pull the data from the back end a single time. And now what we're able to do is build Power BI Desktop projects, and its data sets are pulling data out of the data flow that's already been created. Okay, let's kind of see the big picture. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move back over into the browser. And note that I've created a new workspace for this demo. Okay, also note that if you go in the Power BI Desktop, that you can kind of switch back and forth, between the old look and the new look inside. So I basically have the new look on. If you haven't tried it, you can see that many of the UIs are going to that. Okay, but notice that if I look at data flows, I can come down here and let's create a new data flow. Now, don't think of a data flow as a query. Think of it as a collection of queries. Now, when you create data flows, there's this idea of entities. So when I create the data flow, you're basically going to bring back a rectangle of data, and that rectangle of data is going to have to be named, and the idea is it's an entity, and it basically can follow a lot of new standardizations of the common data service. Okay, I'm not going to get much into that right here. What I want to do is, let's say I go down here and I have a blank query. One of the things that you should be able to do is let's go kind of take that logic, and this is logic that I wrote in Power BI Desktop, and let's go back over here and let's take that logic and let's put it in. Let's go ahead and choose Next. And at first, it basically says I don't have the credentials to connect to that database. Okay, but all the other logic is fine, and as soon as it sees that there's a connection that has to be made, it then can bring that up. Let's go ahead and put, CPT student in, and, once I put the password in, and we go ahead and choose connect, we basically should be able to run that inside there. What is going to be the name of this particular query? It is going to be customers. Let's go ahead and close and save. And, once I close and save here, it's going through this process of validating things. Now, what is the name of your data flow? So when I created that query, I created an entity. And the idea is a data flow can have many entities. So we'll call this something like, sales data flow. just for lack of a better name inside here, let's go ahead and choose Save. And the idea is that now we can basically refresh these. Now, I also find that you can write queries and execute queries in Power BI Desktop. You can write queries in Power BI Desktop, publish the project to the service, and refresh from there. And that's basically a query that refreshes the data set in the service. And then you could write these queries that are entities. And what I find is you have the most flexibility when Power BI Desktop is the only thing involved. Once you start bringing in things that we're going to look at in a little bit later in this session, which is dynamic data sources, all of a sudden you'll find that where they are with Dataflows, they don't support any type of dynamic data source connecting, so all the data sources have to be statically known ahead of time. Okay, so just know that there are some things that you might be able to do in Power BI Desktop, that will not translate to what you can do inside of a data flow. But the idea is that, once we have our data flows, let's go ahead and look back to our data flow inside here. And do we want to go ahead and, refresh that data flow? And, once that data flow gets refreshed in Power BI Desktop, let's go back here. And the last thing I'm going to do in this demo is to, and I think I have another dialog open here. Now that I've created customers somewhere else, let's go ahead and delete that from here. And now that I've deleted that from here, let's go back to new sources. And so, one of the sources that we have, and note that I'm going to go back to the Power BI Desktop window here. And now we have Power BI Data Flows. And so note that I should be able to look in a particular, and what I also find is that if you can't find any data flows, let's go back to my data source settings, and under global permissions, what you might find is that for data flows, you're already pointing to something else, so you might have to delete that. And basically, once you have, deleted pointing to a different data set. Okay, let's see one more time. Let's go back here, and Power BI Data Flows is going to let me connect. Power BI Data Flows, no items to display. Okay, my problem is that it's got me connected to the wrong, to the incorrect account, so it's not seeing that same workspace. Okay, Power BI Data Flows. Let's go ahead and clear the permissions here. And the idea is that once you kind of connect to data flows, you've kind of hard-coded the credentials to one account inside there, or basically one workspace. So now that I've gotten rid of that, I should be able to come back. I should be able to choose data flows. Now it's going to have me sign in. So once again, if you have that problem, you're going to have to drop those credentials. And now, once we have gotten back inside here, we should be able to say connect. And, now that we see this picture, there is a particular app workspace. There are the different data flows. There is customers. Let's go ahead and add that in. And the idea here is that this, user probably shouldn't have to, work on the query very much, because all the work of doing the cleaning and transforming something like a transactional schema of tables, into more of your traditional star schema, can be done by the person building the particular data flow. And the idea is that by the time we load data into individual data sets, we don't have to do as much work. It might be just directly loading in tables and ensuring our relationships, have been created between them. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to kind of get more into working with M-code. Now, when I go through these demos here, I'm going to go back here. Let me go ahead and close the project that I'm working on with Power BI Desktop. And I'm going to show a lot of M code, and what I want you to know is that everything I'm going to show you is in a simple project, and it's basically a project inside the GitHub directory, which is Introduction to M Programming for the Power BI Warrior. That is you. If you're writing M code directly, you are now part of the Power BI Warrior Club. Okay, and note that there's really not much going on in this project in the report. Everything, is going to be viewable through the query editor window. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to start kind of talking about a lot of these different queries that I have here and some of the things that we can do with them. And obviously, I want to turn the formula bar back on. Okay, so M is a functional programming language. And what that means is it's a language where you write formulas that return a value. You don't write formulas or code that does something like you would in a procedural language like VBA or C#. So instead, it's just you write functions, and sometimes when you write a function, you embed two other functions, and those two functions have to be evaluated, before the top function can be evaluated. Now, M is also case sensitive, and when I start writing things inside there, note that the name of a query can be used to directly reference that query from another query. Okay, and what I wanted to kind of show here is, something very simple. If, you're working with queries inside here, for instance, notice that some of these queries have an ABC to the left, so they return a text value. This one returns 1, 2, 3. It returns an integer value. You can see that some queries return a table. That's kind of what we expect most queries to return. But you can also see that some return a list. But if you have a query, such as hello world, now let's go back here and kind of see that when we write queries inside here, we often have this thing which is called the let statement. So let's go ahead and dissect the let statement so you can understand, what it is. Now, before I go through the let statement, let me just say that any type of expression that you can write in M, is a single formula that returns a single value. And the let statement is no exception. Now, the way the let statement works is you have a bunch of functions that are assigned to variable values. And the let block allows you to have multiple expressions, and you basically add commas in between them. Now, what happens is that you have these names where the expression is set equal to. In my example, I'm just using var1, var2, var3. Now, what happens is those names become what we see as applied steps. Now, there's this rub with syntax. And the problem is, if we look down here, look at the bottom, you can kind of see that var1, I can just use it directly. But once I want a variable like var space 2, well, that's not legal in M code to have a space in the name of a variable unless you put it in quotes and put the pound sign in front of it. So note that when you basically just work with the editor, it's creating applied steps that have spaces in it. It's making the names of the applied steps prettier, but it's making your M code, a lot messier. If I go back and we kind of take a look at var1, var2, var3, the M code's really simple, but maybe the applied steps isn't as pretty. But making the applied steps names prettier generally involves making the M code less readable. Now, another thing to think about is that a let statement is an expression that returns a single value. And the idea is that what you have at the bottom after the in keyword, that's the value that the entire let statement returns. However, what we have to do is we basically are going to have to evaluate var3 to evaluate output. To evaluate var3, we have to evaluate var1 and var2. So what happens is this cascading effect of evaluating var1 and var2, then var3, then output, and then just returning a single value back. Now, what would happen if I took what I had in the last example and I basically just reversed the lines? Would this M code work? And the answer is absolutely. The mashup engine would run this without any problem. The problem that you'll find is that you'll confuse the editor and you won't be able to see the applied steps, or you won't be able to work in the WYSIWYG view anymore. You'll have to work entirely in M code, and once again, that's kind of up to you, and for some people, they like doing that, just because they have more control, their M code's more manageable. Now, some of the other things we want to look at is this idea of query folding. Now, if you've used Power Apps, they have a very similar idea, which is they call delegation. But the general idea is that if I have some data and I want to put some filtering, think of a where clause in SQL, or I want to do some sorting, an order by clause in SQL. I'd rather have the backend database engine do that rather than kind of pushing all the rows and making me do the filtering and do the sorting, with the mashup engine. So the idea of query folding is that we're able to kind of push filtering and ordering into the back end. Now, let's say that I have this example right here. I have a database and I say SQL.database. I pull back the customers table, and now I have a filtered rows, and I have table.select rows. Then I have table.select columns. Then I have table.rename columns. So the idea is if you're filtering and you're sorting and your column renaming is right under the place where you're pulling the data from, Power BI Desktop, or more truthfully, the mashup engine, is able to craft up a single SQL statement, that has the where clause, and the order by clause inside of it, and pass that to the back end. Okay. Now, it's also possible for you to write native queries. Now, if you write a native query, you're never going to get any query folding. And one of the things that you see here is if I go back to the last slide here, note that here we're going to say source items, and here I'm basically saying there is a table. Over here, we're basically saying we're pushing in a raw SQL statement. So if you have a native query, it will never do query folding. But conversely, when you do a native query, you're able to put your direct SQL statement in, and you're able to put in your where clause and order by, so you should get the equivalent if you need to use native queries for any reason. Just make sure that you're not bringing back 10,000 rows of data, just to filter down to 1,200. Make sure that the where clause gets sent to the back end. Now, if we want a more kind of general look at M, as a functional programming language, let's talk about the different types that we have. So we have the generic any type. We have things like null. We have logical, numbered, text, binary. There are times when you might have to put, the name of these types in your code. There's also complex types. So there is a way in M code to basically hard code a list, or a record or a table. Now, we can also define user-defined types, and we're going to see some examples of that over the next couple slides. I quickly want to go on a tangent, but so much of this stuff that I'm looking at here, I've learned from this one master, and if I now go to Chris Webb and look for Chris's web on Power Query, Chris works at Microsoft now, but he has hands down, cornered the market on the M expert in our industry. So once again, I really kind of encourage anyone who wants to kind of drill down into what we're going to look at over the next couple slides, to kind of start following Chris. Unfortunately, M code is not like DAX. If you look at DAX and data modeling, there are a ton of great books, led by Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari and a host of others. And when it comes to M, we have a specification and Chris Webb's blog. So it's very lean as far as the resources that you have to kind of really get up to speed on this type of stuff. Now here's an example. So let's say that as I write my M code, I want to initialize the first couple variables, using numeric or Boolean or null values. Okay. You can also see that if I want to create a list, well, it's kind of different than some other languages in the fact that a list, is inside of curly braces and comma delimited. If you then, want to access, something from that particular list, you're able to put in the index, of that thing, once again, in curly braces. And I come from a lot of other languages, where it's square bracket, not curly brace, and I always kind of get confused as they go back and forth between languages. Now, you also have records, and think just like a record in a database. You have a single row of data, and you have name fields that have values. So the idea is that when you put in those square brackets, you're creating a record, and then you have the field name equals a value, comma, another field name equals a value. Okay. And then we're going to have, of course, since we have lists and records, why not a list of records? And then you're able to pull things, out of a single value. So once again, here's the access. Here, if you have a record and you want to pull out a column value, you use the square bracket inside there. Now, let's look at initializing dates and times. One of the strange things that I had to get used to, was the number of functions that start with a pound sign. Pound time, pound date time. But once again, it gives us the ability to hard code, when it's necessary, a date into our M code. Now, let's say that I want to create a list. So here, you can kind of see that we're going to create this simple list called ratpack. Simply a list, think of it as a string array, but we think of it as a list of values, not a list of records. And you can also see that, when it comes time to pick something out inside there, what we can see here is that there is this syntax that kind of tells us that these lists, are zero-based. If I want the first item, it's going to be, inside those curly braces, it's going to be a 0. Okay. Now, you'll also note that what would happen if I said ratpack and inside curly braces 4? Well, that kind of gives me an error because I've asked for an index that doesn't exist in that list. And the last thing I want you to see here is a very kind feature of the M language, and that is that if you reference something, from a list, but you put in an index that doesn't exist, but you put the question mark afterwards, you basically say return a null, don't raise an exception, inside of my M code. Now, here's another neat thing. And once again, this is kind of a Chris Webb technique that I learned, but I think it's a really good example of when you might need to write M code because there's no equivalent way to get there in the UI of Power Query. So let's say that we have a web page and people keep adding these characters, and we find ourselves, doing a search and replace. Take these 3 characters we don't want and replace them, with basically a blank string. Well, then every week these users keep coming up with new characters. So instead of listing the characters you want to strip out, why not list the characters you want to include? So here, what we're going to do is we're going to say, as I go through this text, what are the characters I'll leave inside there? Now, here's also kind of a neat syntax. If I say a.z, that basically gives me uppercase A through Z, and same thing for lowercase. And here's a couple other techniques here. If I, basically want to get the digits 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Here's some other characters. And now what we're going to do is we're going to build a list. And notice if you have a list, you can use the ampersand to basically kind of create a union of the values of several lists. And so now I have the allowed characters. And so finally we'll say text select. and we'll basically give it the characters, and then here are the characters I'm going to allow, and it's going to go through that string, and any character that's not in my allowed chars list is going to be automatically stripped out. So once again, some kind of nice high-end data cleansing techniques, can really benefit from this. Okay, next thing we want to look at is, let's say I want to work with records. And what I want to do is I want to show records and tables in the raw, but then start working towards a fundamental understanding of how to use them, in real-life queries. So here's a couple of examples of some queries. Building some records. I have person 1, person 2, person 3, and there's an example of going to one of those person records and pulling out the value for something like a first name or a last name column. Okay, now, the thing about records is that quite often you're going to call functions that are part of the M function library, and as one of the parameters, they'll make you pass a record. So for instance, if I look at request headers, and if I want to do something like call web contents, and that's going to have an HTTP request go across the network, and I want to set what the headers are, web contents allows me, to basically pass those, but I have to put together a record of what those values are. Also note that one of the HTTP headers is OData max version, and so that name is not allowed in M code unless you put the pound and quotes, around that particular value. Now, look at this options record. So up top here, I created a record, and now I'm basically adding a record inside of a record and then passing that to web.contents. So being able to deal with records, gets to be an important part, of calling a lot of the functions, inside of the M library. Now, I showed you the combination operator, just the ampersand. So all you want to do is parse together text. You can basically have string 1 ampersand string 2. Note that if you have lists, you can just use the ampersand to join them together. And then also, you can use the ampersand with records. If I say, merge record 1 and 2, it's just going to give me, the columns of both combined together. Now, let's say I want to create a table. So I can create a table, and there's table from records. And notice that when I do that, I've got a couple different records inside there. But if I look down below at the WYSIWYG environment, what I can see is that if it has a column that says ABC 1, 2, 3, it means it couldn't determine what the type is, and we're going to leave it as any. And generally, we want strongly typed columns. Now, here's where M code gets to be pretty neat. So what you can do is you can define a record type. So what we're doing here is we're using the type keyword. And I'm going to say, instead of creating a record instance, I want to create a record type that I can use. And so I say first name, and then I specify one of those types. Is it going to be text, logical? So the types that we saw earlier, you're able to use, as the type for your particular column. Okay, once you have done that, now I can say type table, and now I've defined the type of a table whose records are going to match basically that column schema that I've created in the previous line. Now, here's an example of using that. And what you see here is that, once we've done that and we've created this table, my columns are going to be strongly typed. There's lots of people that have this philosophy that if I go out and I take an unstructured text file that's supposed to have 12 columns, what if it only has 10 columns today? So one of the issues is you might not, get all the columns, and you might not get the types correct. But if you take the time just to set up a table using this approach, you can then append what you get from the dynamic data and basically pour it into a table where you've already created the columns and column types, as opposed to, allowing the query to kind of define that on the fly. Okay, now, another thing we want to look at, another advanced technique, is that if I call something like table.selectRows. What happens is that I basically have to point it, to a particular table, and then I have to give it this function. And the idea is that we have kind of an anonymous function, and it's going to pass me this thing, which is the row. And so because there's a function that takes one parameter, they call it a unary function. Okay, now, if I look at this right here, the idea is that we're looking at a table, and I have to decide what records to include and what records to exclude. So they pass the row to me, and then as they pass the row to me, I can basically say, I only want rows, where the customer ID is less than or equal to 10. So I basically have some kind of predicate value inside there. Now, one of the things that they do inside of this language, M, is they have this each syntax. And what I want to show you is that from the first piece of code that you saw at the top to this piece of code to the next, it's all going to be the same as far as how it functionally works. So the idea is that if you call each, it's kind of like automatically defining the function itself. And then down here, I have the underscore, because that is the row, which is basically the record. And now I take a field out of that. So note that while you can use that underscore, if you're enumerating through records, you can also just omit that underscore. So notice that the underscore, or get rid of the underscore, it works fine. And down here, you can kind of see each. And so if I'm having the add column, when I add the column, as we go down row by row, just basically build the value for each row, by taking first name and last name and putting a space in between them. So one of the points here is that while the row itself, can be referenced, it's usually not needed, except for this one case. What would happen if instead of going through a list of records, you were going through just a list of strings? So let's say that as I move through this list of strings, I want to bounce each one to uppercase. Well, now, for me to kind of refer to the string, I have to use the underscore. Okay. Let's look at another example of kind of using some powerful features in M. Now, in this case right here, let's go back to this introduction here. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to go back, and there is running sales total right here. Now, the first thing to note is that I've added an index. And the idea of adding an index, and if I go to add column, and I can basically choose to, add an index column. And if I add an index column, I can start it from 0, I can start it from 1, I can start it from any value. And it basically just kind of numbers the rows in your query. And this indexing has nothing to do with the original data or any type of index or ID. It basically just says, in my query output, basically give me a unique index for each one. And so what's kind of neat there is that now what we can do is we can add a column. And what I'd like to do is when I get down to this row, I want to basically take sales, and I want to basically go from the beginning, from the first row to this row, and basically add that up. Okay, so back here, what you can see is that the first thing we'll say is list range. And list range added index, so we're going to go to that index column, and we're going to say, let's go ahead and start at 0, and let's go to index plus 1. And notice that because my index started at 0, I have to say plus 1. But now we'll go ahead and we'll just do a sum. So list.sum says I have a list of integers. Let's go ahead and sum that up. And that's how we get, basically those sum values. Okay. Now, as you start working with M, you'll realize that there are, quite a few libraries or library functions that we can use. Now, note that, let's say you have data, that is inside of a web service. So if your web service is OData, I can either say OData.feed or we can use web contents. And OData.feed understands OData data sources. And so one of the neat things about working with OData is that here, we're going to say, what is the source? What is the table? And you're able to basically then select what columns that you want. Okay, now just to give you kind of a basic sense of this, let me go back here and I'm going to open this up, and I have this particular API right here. So back here in Power BI Desktop, if I basically say give me a new source, give me a OData feed inside here, and note that now this can allow me to see the different pieces of data that I'm going to work with. Okay, and so now one of the things that we might do is, let's say I come back here, and just for a simple example, we'll put a number filter where it's less than or equal to, and we'll basically put in 10. Okay, and so what's kind of neat about this is because it's an OData data source, they're able to use query folding, and they don't have to bring back all the rows, then apply the filter. Now, what you might also see is that when you use the OData data source, that quite often has to make 2 or 3 queries instead of just one round trip to the server because it has to get metadata. So another approach that we could use, is instead of using, the OData data source, just to basically use web.contents. So let's go back here, and let's say that I go ahead and put it into web.contents. And so this doesn't understand, what the data looks like coming back. So what we're able to do is we're able to kind of drill down, into where it says records. Now, I'm going to go through this a little bit more in just a second. But what I want you to see here is that if you use web contents, it doesn't really make any assumption about the place it's pulling the data from. It certainly doesn't know that it's an OData data source, so you're not going to get any type of query folding. So instead, if you're able to put together something like, what I have here, where I'm going to go ahead and use the select, $select, and ask for just the columns that I want. So it's kind of like a native query. You're not going to get any type of query folding, so you better put your where clause, and what columns you want, inside of the query itself. So if we go back here, and I'm going to go ahead and just create a new one here. So let's go back and go back to web. And so in this case right here, we're going to pull back data. And as the data comes back, it comes back as a list. It's really a list of records. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on once because we've got to get to the list of records. Now we've done that, we can basically convert it over to a table. Now, once I convert it to a table and I have a table of records, that gives me, the ability to now kind of expand. And once we've done that inside here, I've gotten back exactly what I want. I might have to go kind of tighten up the columns. But, in general, what people find is that the OData approach is more metadata driven and can do things like query folding, but it might have extra calls. And so, basically going with web contents, while there was a lot of extra stuff I had to do, might give you better performance just because of, the need to only call to the data source once and ask for exactly the data that you need inside there. Now, next thing we want to look at is query functions. Now, the idea of a query function is that you've got some data, and with your data, what you'd like to be able to do is to have a dynamic data source. Okay, now I think I got time for one more demo here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my data here and notice that I've got some data that's in a fixed width file inside here. If I kind of open this up, inside this editor, what you can see here is that this is data we need to be able to consume, and we have lots of these different files. Now, for this demo, I am also, if I can get to the right browser, I'm going to go back, and I have a document library, which basically is in SharePoint. And I want to take 3 of these and put them inside here. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of take the last 5 minutes to go through quickly and kind of show, how we can write a query function. Now, when I want to pull a file from SharePoint, what I need to do is I need to use web.contents. I need to know, what is the URL of, the site and the root of that document library. So let's go ahead and put, Notepad inside here. And then also, what is the name of the file? So if I go here and I kind of do a rename, okay, so now I've got a file name. So let's go back to Power BI Desktop. And here in Power BI Desktop, we're going to create one new project. And we're going to write a query that knows how to pull the data out of that one file, but then we're going to get rid of the hard-coded file name and make it a generic function that I can use, over multiple files. Okay, so step 1 is we're going to say get data from web. Now, if it's the first time you've accessed data from this particular location, it's going to prompt you for credentials and access to data is written. What did I do inside here? That, okay. And I think what I need to do is I need to go to data source settings. And sorry about this. I know we're kind of running out of time here. Let's go ahead and clear those permissions. So it'll ask me again. Okay, so one more time. We're going to go back here, and we're going to pull this data from this location inside here. So I want to go ahead and okay, let me see. I have, I'm not sure why I'm getting an error there, but let me kind of bring up this. And so the idea, with this particular function that I want to show, and let me bring up the query window here. I'm not sure why I was getting that error. Okay, I think I've kind of, that's not going to work either. Okay, I'm sorry. I think I have done something. I'm not sure why I'm not getting. Let me try one more thing. My apologies that I have to kind of start and restart. Okay, I'm going to give this one more shot. My time is running out. I realize that. And what I am trying my best to do here is go back to that file there and bring it down. So that particular file was inside here, and it's connecting. Okay, I have no idea why I was getting an error there, but I'm going to go back here, and at this point, what I think we need to do is kind of just end up. So my apologies that last one didn't work out, but kind of the hope was that we could introduce you to M-code, get you to begin working with M-code. Last thing I want to do is just kind of mention that we do at Critical Path Training, have some deep dives, into different types of Power BI training. And if we just kind of end up by going to critical path training and kind of taking a look at our particular courses, the Power BI Certification Bootcamp, would be a course where if you are working with Power BI Desktop and kind of need to master report and dashboard building, as well as managing data sets and rolling out applications to a large audience, that's a good course. Also, we have Power BI Developer Bootcamp, which is more geared towards professional developers who work with Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code and Node.js, which basically gets into different development scenarios such as using Power BI embedding, developing custom visuals, working with Python and R, things like that. Okay, so my apologies, our final demo kind of went up in flames. But thanks for joining us for the first installment of our August webinar series. And we'll follow up with you and basically let you know when the recording is available. So once again, thanks everyone for attending today. I hope you enjoyed our hour that we spent together. Cheers.